Right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. My name's Heather, and we're going to be talking today about cells and the basics of cells. So, this is just an introduction course, so we're not going to get too in depth, but I want to go ahead and talk to you a little bit about the basics. So, without further ado, what does it mean to be alive? And when I think of this question, I always go back to childhood and I think of, my imagination going and talking about a rock and making it talk. And, to me, a rock was alive and a plant was alive and I was alive. And I always asked, well, how do I know for sure if something is truly alive? Well, one of the first things that pops into my head is heartbeat. When I think of someone being alive, I think of their heart beating, and I know mine does. And when I'm a little kid, that's kind of what I go to. But that's not what we determine what is alive, because you think of plants, and plants don't have heartbeats, but yet they're still living. So, what is it about them that makes them alive? So we have to go back to something called a cell. And if something is a cell is considered to be living because it can function on its own. Now, cells are considered to be the smallest unit of life because it is the smallest thing that can perform all functions of life. Meaning, things inside a cell, like a nucleus, as you see here, is not something that is considered to be alive because a nucleus, even though it's very important, can't function on its own. So, the basics are cells are what is determined to be alive. We have to be made up of cells, and even if it's a single cell or something like bacteria, that's still considered to be alive because it has cells that can perform all the functions of life. So to me, like I said, I go back to childhood and think of if someone told me that that's what it means to be alive, I would have no idea what they're talking about. But now that we have a little bit of biology under our belt, we know that, it's not a heartbeat, but it's the fact that it's contained cells, which is the basic units of life. So, going on to the cell theory. Back in the 1800s, before we realized that everything was made of cells, we didn't really have an answer to that question of what does it mean to be alive. But we have some scientists that contributed to this thing called cell theory. Now we have Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann, and I apologize if I'm not saying their names correctly, but they worked together along with many other scientists to make up the cell theory. Now, the cell theory contains three very basic things. All living things are made up of cells. Cells are the basic units of life, and living cells come only from other living cells, meaning I can't just create a cell out of nowhere and make it alive. I can't take a rock cell, because rocks don't contain cells, and make a new cell. It has to be from something that's living. Now, going back to these two scientists, I want to touch base a little bit on the work that they did because I think it's just fascinating. We're going to start here with Matthias Jacob Schleiden. He was born in 1804 and passed away in 1881, and he was a German botanist. Now, he studied plants, he looked at plants, and he defined the cell as a basic unit of life for plants. So he was looking and realized that, plants are indeed made up of cells. Now, in the meantime, this guy over here named Theodor Schwann, who was born in 1810 and died in 1882, around the same time, was also a German scientist, and he was studying animals. Now, he came up with the same theory that Schleiden did, that, in fact, animals are too indeed made up of cells, and therefore their work together, they determined that we needed a theory about cells and about what makes something alive. So they were huge contributors to the cell theory and what we're going to talk about today. So I wanted to mention their names real quick. Moving right along, we're going to talk about prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells or organisms. And we're going to start with the basic one, which is prokaryotic. And when we think about prokaryotic, we have some differences. Now, prokaryotic cells have a cell membrane or, a plasma membrane. So you can see if you're looking at this picture of one under a microscope, you can see that it has this line going around the cell. That's to protect it. Now, eukaryotic cells also have this, and we're going to look at those in just a second. This also has a cell wall, which provides extra support in a prokaryotic cell. They're not very big, as you can see, and they're kind of this oval shape. And then one of the main differences is that we all have DNA. However, in a prokaryotic cell, they don't see a nucleus here. Now, they do have this kind of blob looking thing, and that is a cytoplasm. Now, for a prokaryotic cell, that is where all of their DNA is stored, and that's going to come up a little bit later when we talk about organelles and how these two differ. So prokaryotic cells do not have membrane-bound organelles like eukaryotic cells do. They do have lots of stuff going on in there, but not the same thing like eukaryotic cells. So if we take a look at a eukaryotic cell picture, we see this is a plant one. We do see a cell wall. They also have the plasma membrane. It's a little bit harder to see in here. But eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, as you can picture right here, which holds all of the DNA. Now, eukaryotic cells also have internal membranes, and like I said before, they contain all the organelles that we're going to talk about here in just a second, whereas prokaryotic cells don't. So when we look at some organelles, I want to show you this website. It's called Cells Alive. It's just right on the web, and they give you a choice to choose between animal cell or plant cell. We're going to stay in the plant cell today because I think you can see a little bit more. Now, I like this site because A, it shows pictures, it has arrows, and then it also allows them to click on this and find out a little bit more information, which you're not going to see today, but I just wanted to mention that. So, taking a look at some organelles and their functions. We mentioned the cell wall that provides that extra support. Now, this is not found in animal cells, but it is there for plant cells for that extra support. What is in both is this cell membrane. It's that line that goes all the way across. That is going to house all of the organelles within that and provide extra support for them. Now, if we take a look here, this big looking swimming pool, that's something that my eyes draw right to, especially if I'm a kid looking at this picture. And this is called a vacuole. Now, the vacuole stores nutrients and waste, as well as it helps increase the cell size during plant growth. The most fascinating thing about the vacuole is that water collects here and monitors turgor pressure. So if the pressure in the cell drops, then the plant will wilt. So it has an important job because we need to keep water and nutrients in here so that the plant can stay alive. Now, if you take a look in this cell, this takes up almost more than half the cell. Now, in an animal cell, it still exists. It's just not as large. All right, we're going to kind of go back to this outer kind of area, and this is called the cytoskeleton. So we take a look and we notice 3 green oval things and then kind of 4 here in this picture. Now, these are called chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are housed in the cytoskeleton, and they're responsible for capturing energy from sunlight. They play an important role in helping the cell turn the energy into sugars through a process called photosynthesis. So that is why they're green. So they contain chlorophyll, and they help in the process of photosynthesis. Now, if you take a look back at the cytoskeleton, you also see these spaghetti-like noodles, and then over here we see these microtubules. These are, they all have important jobs. In the cytoskeleton, which makes up all of that, helps with cell shape, but it also helps with cell locomotion, so how the cell moves freely and the organelles around in there as well. It's kind of like a woven network there for you. Now, if we're moving right along, we're going to find the mitochondrion. So these are these 2 little things over here. They're oval shaped. They're smaller than the chloroplasts. And the mitochondrion also has an important job. They have a double layer membrane, and the main function of this organelle is to help provide the cell with energy to move. So it also produces secretory products and helps the cell divide when needed. So they have a couple jobs. It's kind of like the powerhouse of the cell. Next to that is the Golgi apparatus. I think of this as kind of like a little maze, and this is also a membrane-bound organelle. It contains a single membrane, and it plays an important role in packaging macromolecules. So it kind of is found in different locations depending on what eukaryotic cell you're in, but it helps give the access to the hormones and enzymes that the plant or animal would need. So that's kind of also an important job. I'm going to keep repeating that because almost all of these are important. Otherwise, the cell would not be able to perform the functions of life. All right, we have some endoplasmic reticulum. These are the rough ones. Up here is the smooth one. And with that, this one's called rough because it kind of looks like pebbled. This is more smooth and it looks like just kind of a direct access. And this is where proteins are synthesized and then collected to be transported throughout the cell. So it's a series of canals that helps things transport, and it gives direct access, as you can see, to the main thing called the nucleus. And the nucleus is what I consider to be the information center. So this is where all the DNA is stored. It's here that it's kind of like the manual, or information center. So it tells everything in the cell and all the organelles what to do. So without this, we wouldn't get very far. A couple other little ones that I would just want to mention. We have the lysosome right here. It kind of looks like a little pea. And they are more common in animal cells, but they still exist in plant cells. And they contain enzymes that help with internal cell digestion. So they can kill and eat bacteria, which is really good. And then the last one is another little round one, and these are peroxisomes. And these are helping in protection against toxic hydrogen peroxide that the cell would produce. So we need those as well. So as you can see, there are a lot of membrane-bound organelles, and this is a great website to kind of just take a look at all the different parts that make up a eukaryotic cell. Now let's get back to this real quick. Sorry as it loads. And the last thing that we want to talk about is some viruses and viruses and prions. So viruses, we want to figure out too, are they alive? What do they do? Can antibiotics stop them? So viruses are things that you probably have had before, and unfortunately, they are not alive. So, and I guess that's fortunate. They cannot function on their own. They actually need other living cells to help them survive and reproduce. As you can see, they cause diseases. There's, the influenza, which is the flu. We have, the complex structure. We have the helical tobacco one. All of these viruses cannot be stopped by antibiotics because, because they are not, sorry, we have a thing moving here. They are not something that is bacteria driven, so only antibiotics can kill bacteria. So this is something that just kind of has to run its course, and unfortunately, like I said, the cell it's not a living cell, so it's going to need the living cells to help it live and reproduce. The next and the last thing we want to talk about is prions. They're similar to viruses. They cannot be stopped by antibiotics, unfortunately. And these prions can reproduce on their own, and they can become infectious. So this is a normal protein. This is what a disease-causing protein looks like. And the disease-causing form is resistant to being broken down. So it's believed that prions may be involved in communication between neurons, cell death, and maybe even controlling sleep patterns. They're not cells because prions cannot live on their own, and they also do not contain any genetic material. Now, they tend to stick together, and over time, as they stack up and form these long chains, that's how they become very toxic, and they become disease-eating or disease-forming. And some of the diseases that prions cause are fatal familial insomnia or Kuro, and this can affect anything that has cells: humans, goats, sheep. And like I said before, antibiotics don't work against them. So that is it for our introduction to cells. I really hope that you enjoyed the work here, and if you have any further questions, please feel free to contact me.